All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful to have everyone here today, to see so many folks on Zoom and also here in person in the room with us for the first of what will be 6 sessions of Beyond the Bombs, Metro DC DSA's new Anti-Imperialist Summer School. This is the first time that the chapter is doing something like this, and so I'm really excited to see how this experiment goes with you all. To introduce myself, my name is Pranay. I'm an organizer with the Internationalism Working Group at Metro DC DSA, and along with several of my comrades in IWG, we've put together this series which is going to run over the course of the next 6 weeks. Now, before we really get into the content of today's session, I want to set the stage for why we're launching this series and why we thought it was important to have this 6-week summer school on what imperialism is and how it functions in the world. And so to set that stage, I'm wondering if someone in the audience wants to read off the quote that's on the screen.
Imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. Ghassan Kanafani, revolutionary Palestinian writer and spokesman of the PFLP.
All right, thank you so much. This is a very famous quote, some of you all may have seen it before, by Ghassan Kanafani, who was the spokesperson for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He was a legendary Palestinian revolutionary and freedom fighter and political thinker, and also one of really the greatest Palestinian literary figures of the 20th century. But in addition to all of that, Kanafani was also a Marxist and a socialist. And he really saw the cause of Palestinian liberation as a socialist struggle, a fundamentally socialist struggle for the liberation of the Palestinian working class, for Palestinians as a part of the global working class. And also importantly, he saw the Palestinian liberation struggle as part of the larger struggle against imperialism on the world stage. And I think that this quote here really goes to show how Kanafani, like so many socialists across the Third World and the Global South throughout the 20th century, understood that even as they were fighting against capitalism and fighting to raise working class consciousness, ultimately that fight had to be an anti-imperialist one. It had to be concerned with overthrowing colonialism, winning national liberation for their peoples, and that was a necessary precondition to any sort of genuinely liberated or any sort of genuinely socialist future. And so, yeah, Kanafani, as I said, really understood, like many of his contemporaries, that the defining struggle of his time was the struggle against empire. And I want to make the case, not just here today, but throughout the rest of this course over the next 6 weeks, that the struggle against empire is also the defining struggle of our time today. And that really we cannot, as socialists and leftists, particularly located here in the heart of empire, Washington, D.C. of all places, we cannot afford to lose sight of that fact. You know, we can't afford to fall into the trap of thinking that just because colonies won political independence in the 20th century that the anti-imperialist struggle is over. That is a trap we cannot afford to fall into. And so I really hope to sort of drive that home over the rest of today's session and the rest of the next 6 weeks of this course. Now, of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen the unfolding of really important political developments globally. Specifically, of course, I'm talking about the genocide in Gaza that's been going on for almost 2 years now. And I think that these developments, the genocide in Palestine, but also others as well, have really brought the concept of imperialism back into the political vocabulary of so many people around the world. I know I myself have been at so many different protests and rallies over the last couple of years where speakers are talking openly about imperialism and the need to resist it. They're using that word imperialism explicitly in a way that at least I hadn't really heard as much before, right? And I think that's been true for a lot of people's experience of going to protest and hearing imperialism talked about explicitly, hearing the protest demands being framed in anti-imperialist terms. And I think that, this is because what we've seen unfold over the last 2 years, not just the genocide itself, but also the way that the so-called international community has responded to it, the hypocrisy and the callousness and the brutality, it's really laid bare for so many people, millions of people around the world. It has laid bare for them this structural violence and the structural injustice of the global order that we live in today. This is a global order that has been designed over the course of centuries, really, to privilege the West, to privilege the powerful and the rich countries that benefit from the exploitation of everybody else. But at the same time, while I think a lot of people's awareness of imperialism as a political force has increased, unfortunately, I think that for a lot of folks, the strength of their analysis of imperialism hasn't increased. And what I mean by that is that I think if you asked most people today, a lot of people, including many self-professed leftists, self-professed socialists, and Marxists, to define what they mean when they talk about imperialism, what do they mean by that word, they'll probably offer a definition that may, capture pieces of what imperialism is really about, but doesn't really encompass the full scope or the full complexity of what really we're referring to when we use this term. And so the purpose of this series of the Anti-Imperialist Summer School is to help provide a crash course not only in what exactly imperialism is, but also to provide a crash course in the most significant institutions and structures and avenues by which imperialism functions in reality, in the real world that we live in today. And so we intentionally, chose this title for the series, Beyond the Bombs, Anti-Imperialist Summer School. We chose that title, Beyond the Bombs, because we really wanted to go beyond a surface level of empire, a surface level understanding of empire, rather, that treats it as being simply synonymous with war, synonymous with militarism, with foreign intervention or invasions or coups d'etats, because that's often a way that it gets talked about, as if imperialism is synonymous with and reducible to those things. And that is certainly part of imperialism, but that is just one part of a much bigger picture. So we really want to focus this course on that bigger picture, on the political economy of empire in particular, the not so overtly militarized ways that empire operates today.
So just a quick overview of how this course and the session is going to be structured. We'll start off with a presentation, probably 45 minutes or so each week, led by myself and others in the working group. Today it'll be just me, but next week onwards we'll have other folks as well. To sort of get into it, to break down what do we mean when we talk about imperialism. So yeah, that I think is actually one of the most common ways. It is really the emphasis on imperialism as a historical phenomenon, sort of bygone that happened, usually ended after World War II as countries began becoming independent, right? So I want to identify a few of the sort of major misunderstandings about what imperialism is. Like we just said, there's imperialism as a bygone phenomenon, a thing of the past. And even if people talk about imperialism as something that exists in the world today, you often hear it talked about as, one of the other things on this list, right? Something that's primarily about manifesting through military intervention, coups, invasion, other forms of direct physical violence that primarily the U.S. exerts against other countries. The invasion of Iraq, for example, or the overthrow of the Gaddafi government in Libya as examples of imperialism. You also hear it talked about as a practice that states engage in that is really just defined as expanding their territory or otherwise projecting power beyond their borders. And then finally, I think another way that often we hear imperialism talked about is something that can be fully understood by looking at individual states and the relationship between them. So country A is behaving imperialistically towards country B. That's something that I think also is often comes up in these discussions. And none of these are necessarily incorrect on their own. I mean, they all do encompass aspects of how imperialism functions, both historically and in the present day. But I think it's important to recognize that this only is part of a much bigger picture. And if you only think of imperialism in these terms, you really start to lose the bigger picture. I think a lot of people can understand why it's probably, or can guess why it's inaccurate to frame imperialism as the first thing on this list as a bygone historical phenomenon. Obviously, we live in a world where empire still exists. I think everyone who's here, you signed up for this class because you believe that on some level and you want to understand more why that happens. I think it's the other three that on this list that people really get tripped up on. And I think the fatal flaw that all of them share is that they look at imperialism through an overly narrow lens, right? It focuses too much on certain specific aspects, but doesn't look at the bigger picture, and it misses the forest for the trees. So the rest of this lecture and the series over the next 6 weeks more broadly will be dedicated to filling in that missing background and context. And the way I want to do that is by offering a more thorough understanding of imperialism that goes beyond looking at it as a practice that states engage in, and instead looking at imperialism as a system. Like I said, the crudest sort of version of this is that you could define it as just one country exerting influence over another country. But the biggest problem, and that could take the form of invasion, could take the form of conquest, or it could just take the form of applying diplomatic pressure so that country votes the way you want it to with the UN, right? The biggest problem with understanding imperialism in that way is that it doesn't tell us anything about the political economy, about who benefits and how and why. Even if we look at just how empire worked in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, the sort of heyday of classical imperialism, it wasn't just that these European countries were sending their armies rampaging around the world, invading and conquering for fun, or just to say because we have a superior civilization. That would be an extremely costly endeavor to do just for the hell of it. The reason why European powers had an interest in building empires was because there was profit being made. It was plunder. It was for economic benefits that were then used to enable the rise of wealth and capitalism in Europe and in the West more broadly. And so that was always been the case for how imperialism functions. We'll get more into that shortly here. But also it's the case for why imperialism exists today. It's fundamentally about money. It's about political economy. And I think that is really important to drive home. So with that in mind, I want to offer an alternative understanding of imperialism as a system, a globalized system of capitalism that's extended on a world scale, and that the system is premised on the coercive, the exploitative, and the parasitic relationship between the powerful developed societies and the oppressed and exploited societies, where wealth, value, labor, resources are transferred from poor countries to the rich countries through a variety of coercive means, but all of which end up reinforcing these patterns of inequality, of dependence, and deny the sovereignty to the vast majority of the world's population that they deserve. And this is a way of understanding imperialism that's very much rooted in the socialist and specifically the Marxist tradition, because going all the way back to Karl Marx, socialists have always understood that the way capitalism as an economic system functions is not just within one country, but it is in fact a global economic system. And you cannot understand capitalism without understanding imperialism. Therefore, you also can't oppose capitalism without opposing imperialism. So another quote here, if someone in the audience wants to figure it out.
The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1.
Thank you so much. So yeah, this is, as it says here on the slide, a quote from Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. I think it's also one of the quotes from that text that really sticks out to me. I think it's really beautifully written. I think the prose is really evocative. And I think it also really gets at the heart of how capitalism is intertwined with imperialism. What Marx is saying here in this quote is that from the very beginning of capitalism, from the earliest stages of what he called primitive accumulation, which is essentially the process by which when capitalism as a system was first getting started, they accumulated they think of it as the startup funding that it needed to fund the development of all this industry in Europe. All that money had to come from somewhere, right? These were feudal societies which had a lot of wealth in the hands of these royal and aristocratic families, but not enough to finance the entire transition to an industrial capitalist economy. So where does that money come from? It comes from the mines of the Americas. It comes from the slave markets of Africa. It comes from all the rest of the world where these European kingdoms and powers turned to suck up capital that was then used to finance the development of capitalism. And I think what this really tells us, it's really important to emphasize that the places that Marx names in this quote, they're dispersed all over the world. He's talking about the East Indies, he's talking about Africa, he's talking about South America, right? And the Americas in general. This really goes to show, I think, just how global the scale of capitalism operates on, and therefore how global the scale of imperialism operates on. And so with that in mind, I think we can already start to see why it's maybe problematic, or at least insufficient, to understand imperialism as something that only happens between individual states, right? That this country is behaving imperialistically towards this other country, rather than seeing it as a more global system into which countries are integrated in different ways, some as the victims of it, some as the people who can't benefit from it. And so for an illustrative example, because I know I've been talking about this in kind of abstract terms, I want to sort of concretize this a little bit by looking at the example of what is perhaps the most famous empire in world history, the British Empire. This was a map published by British colonial authorities. I got it from the Library of Congress website. And so for folks who know a British imperial history, I mean, the very sort of canned version of it is that it started out first with the British, these private companies, primarily the British East India Company, which was started in the 1600s. And primarily, with the support of the crown, it had its own private army, but really it was a trading company. And what it was trying to do was go to the far-off lands of South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia as well, and bring back commodities, spices, precious metals, textiles, all of these things that you couldn't get on the British Isles. Import them back, primarily to be sold as luxuries for the consumption of the elites, the ruling class of Britain. So when the East India Company first arrived on the shores of the Indian subcontinent, it encountered the Mughal Empire and other sort of Indian kingdoms that control the subcontinent at this time. And these are fabulously wealthy kingdoms, particularly the Mughals. I mean, I think it's hard to understand now just how much of in the global economy at the time, how much of a powerhouse the Mughal Empire really was. And one of the most sought after exports these kingdoms had to offer was textiles. I mean, these travelers would go from all over the world to South Asia and right back with these incredible stories about the beautiful silks, these incredible cloths that these artisanal weavers were creating in India. They perfected over generations. And so these were really considered to be the finest cloth and textile products in the world. And they were extremely sought after by Europe's ruling elites who were buying them from the East India Company. One very famous example is a cloth called Dhaka Muslim, which was made in the city of Dhaka, now Bangladesh. The way to produce this type of cloth has been lost to time because of the way this industry was destroyed, which we'll talk about shortly. But it was known by people at the time as being, quote, lighter than woven air. And it was at that time the most expensive fabric in the world. So this is initially what the East India Company is trying to bring back to Britain. But you get into the late 1700s, you get into the 18th century, and something major starts to happen in Britain economically at the time that really completely radically transforms the way the British economy works. Yes, factory production, different revolution, the Industrial Revolution. This completely upended the way Britain's economy functioned. And one of the biggest industries that emerged benefiting from this mass industrial production in Britain was the textile industry, particularly in the county of Lancashire in England. You suddenly have these massive industrial textile factories that were churning out incredible quantities of cheap, mass-produced cloths, right? You had a new class of British proletariat, working class people who were being paid factory wages to produce these industrial scale cloth production. And Britain quickly becomes one of the world's major centers of this production. And obviously it's still cloth, but this is very different than the fine artisanal hand-woven stuff that's being made in India. And so as this transformation is happening, you have these industrial cloth production firms being coming up in Britain. Then you have these far-off lands like India that are important markets now to offload the amount of cloth that's being produced. They're producing more cloth than they can sell to the underpaid British workers, right? Or even to the British ruling class. So now they start shipping off this cloth to India because they have access to all of these markets. The East India Company, of course, has a massive military force backing it. It has the approval of the British Crown. So they start using that force to pressure Indian rulers into signing treaties that establish lopsided trade relationships, where it makes it all too easy for the East India Company to flood markets in India with this cheap British textiles. And as beautiful as cloth produced by Indian workers is, they just can't compete with it. I mean, it's so much more expensive. It's so much more labor intensive to produce. And so as a result, the artisanal indigenous hand weaving industry was quickly devastated. Just to give context, in the 17th century, India made up 25% of global textile production. In 1947, when India became independent from British rule, it was just 2% of textile production. And there's some really horrific stories about this wasn't just market forces, but there was also direct violence and physical brutality by which the thumbs of the weavers were smashed by colonial officials, famously with hammers, and so on. And so, as a result, what this means is that in Britain, you have this new class of industrial capitalists, the people who own these factories, who own these companies, who are getting extremely rich, not just off of exploiting the British workers who are, being underpaid, working 20-hour days in these mills in Lancashire, but now they're also getting rich off the devastation of India's textile economy, which is now placing all these Indian kingdoms in a subservient relationship to the British Crown. And so what that leads to is a situation in which all of these farmers in India, who were growing for centuries, were growing cotton that was being used to produce these textiles, well, they no longer have a textile industry to sell their cotton to. They come under pressure from the British authorities to instead start growing poppies for opium. Why did the British want to produce opium? Because the British had an interest in getting into the markets in China, which did not want to trade with the British. China was also extremely wealthy. They saw the British as a negative influence on their society. And so they were refusing to trade openly with the British. So instead, as a way to sort of break them from within and get access to all of these markets as well in China, the British start smuggling opium, which is grown in India, on the black market into China, to try to get the population addicted to this famously extremely addictive drug, and destabilize the country from within, make it more malleable to outside influence. But also, very importantly, the black market opium trade means that all these British merchants now have a much greater quantity of silver because that's what's being used by the Chinese economy as the currency at the time. That silver from the black market opium trade is loaded onto ships, sailed back to Britain, where it flows into the vaults of the banks in London. Those banks in London, of course, are the ones who are lending out the capital to establish industrial production, to establish a capitalist economy in Britain. And so the silver that they're getting for that is from the Chinese black market. The Chinese black market is getting its opium from the former cotton fields of India, who are now being forced to grow opium because they don't have anything to sell their cotton to. So we're already seeing how global of a scale this is. But you might be asking, just to sort of drive this home, where did the cotton mills of Lancashire get their cotton from? Not growing cotton in Britain, right? The answer: the slave plantations of the American South. And so if we take a step back here and we look at the story that we just told, I know I went into a lot of detail because I really want to drive home just how global of a process imperialism was. It wasn't just that Britain wanted to conquer India, Britain wanted to conquer this country or that country. It was about integrating the global economy in a very particular way that would benefit the newly emerging capitalist class in Britain. And if you look at just one piece of this puzzle, if you look at Britain's relationship to China, or Britain's relationship to the Mughals in India, or Britain's relationship to the American state economy, you would miss so many crucial aspects of the overall picture. And in fact, we're actually falling victim to that right now because the narrative I just told you only focuses on a few key industries like textiles and opium. We haven't even talked about tea. We haven't even talked about precious metals. We didn't even mention British colonies in Africa. And we certainly didn't even mention not just Britain, but Spain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, every other European power that was doing the exact same thing in other parts of the world. And all of this combines to again, create a global economy that is structured in a way to facilitate the flow of wealth from the colonies to a handful of very small European powers that are getting rich off of all of this. So again, all of this is to say you simply cannot understand imperialism without thinking of it as a global system, which is very different from the way that we're taught to talk about it as a relationship that exists between individual states. And just to make a quick point about the role of the military in all of this, of course, this couldn't have happened without the military force of the British Empire. It was through battles like the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where the Nawab of Bengal was defeated by the East India Company's army. That was how they were able to essentially, hold a gun to the heads of these rulers, force them to sign these unfair treaties. But the military force was only relevant to the expansion of the British Empire insofar as it enabled them to enforce the economic relationships they wanted to establish. They were not conquering and invading for the sake of conquering and invading. They didn't want to take on all this new population that they're responsible for governing. They were conquering and invading because that was how they could enforce the economic transfer of wealth from the colonies to the heart of empire. And it was that economic transfer that really lay at the heart of imperialism. I'm going to pause away and take a sip of water. Okay, so now that hopefully I have driven home for you, perhaps in exhaustive detail, the importance of why we need to think about empire in global terms, I want to turn to the question of how Marxists specifically understand empire. And to do that, I want to talk about one of the most important contributions, probably the most important contribution to Marxist understandings of imperialism, which came, of course, from Vladimir Lenin. In 1917, Lenin wrote his very famous pamphlet, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which, if you haven't read, I highly recommend you do. It's a pretty short book and has a lot of wisdom that I think still applies to our moment today. And a lot of people would say actually that this was Lenin's most revolutionary contribution to Marxist theory. It's a big part of why so many national liberation and anti-colonial struggles in the Third World took on a Marxist bent, were because of the way that Lenin contributed to the Marxist canon of understanding of imperialism. And the way that he understood imperialism came out of the context in which he was writing. Lenin, of course, published this in 1917. He wrote this text amid the backdrop of World War I, at a time when he was trying to understand the situation in Europe. All of these imperial powers were going to war with each other, and most importantly, trying to understand why are all the socialist movements in each of these European countries not opposing the war. You know, you have socialist parties in Britain, in Germany, in France, lining up to support the nationalist cause rather than taking on international working class solidarity. And so Lenin wrote this text trying to understand what was going on with that failure to oppose the war, and also more broadly with the European situation. And so what Lenin did was he identified sort of the way the capitalist system was developing at the time. And examining that development, he identified a trend. Capitalism was trending increasingly at this point. You know, most of these countries had been capitalist for several decades. It was trending away from pure free market competition, lots of individual firms competing with each other, and instead towards more and more centralization, more and more monopoly, and concentration in the market. You had a handful of firms that were starting to emerge as monopoly powers. They were pursuing ever increasing growth. They wanted to continue expanding the size of their business, expanding their profits, their revenues. And so this means that they have an incentive to keep pursuing new places to invest, new markets to sell in. It also leads to a greater concentration of capital because banks start to play a more and more powerful role in bankrolling all of this and controlling political and economic power in the West, in Europe at this time. And as this is happening, Lenin says, as capitalism reaches this monopoly stage, it begins turning outwards. Again, these British companies can no longer just look for places to invest in Britain. They have to look elsewhere. So they look German companies and French companies and so on. And it looks for other less developed countries, i.e. colonies, where capital can invest. It can exploit much cheaper labor costs, much cheaper resources. The fact there isn't as much of a developed political culture in the same way, which means that as exploited as a British factory worker is, you know, as much surplus value as the boss is taking from them, they're getting paid much more for their work in a factory than, you know, a worker in a British factory somewhere in Africa or India or wherever else, right? There's an additional degree of exploitation that emerges when you have a European capitalist interest that is investing in a much cheaper and much poorer country. And this creates abnormally high profits. Lenin gave this the term super profits. And this idea of super profits, he says, were used by the ruling class in these capitalist European countries to essentially drive their working class because they want to, you know, there's a trade union movement, there's more and more people talking about socialism. They want to tamp down that energy. It's the last thing they want is revolution. So they make these little social democratic compromises. Okay, you can have a weekend, you know, you can have an 8-hour working day. People will have some degree of social welfare programs that emerge. And that is funded by the super profits that are being extracted from the exploitation of the colonies. And essentially it keeps the working class of the capitalist countries complacent, keep them from challenging the capitalist system. And this is something that we still see today. As a case in point, you know, I think a lot of people on the left in the US hold up the Nordic countries, particularly Sweden, as a sort of example of a democratic socialist or a social democratic society where you have a very regulated economy, you have a lot of state intervention and very wide social safety net. And that's all true. But it's also worth pointing out that a country like Sweden is a member of NATO and on a per capita basis is one of the top 3 weapons exporters in the world. The way Sweden is integrated into the global capitalist system is very much on the side of the imperialist countries. And it is the economic benefits that Sweden reaps from that integration that give it the wealth that it needs to have such a robust welfare state, such an incredible public healthcare system, education system, and all of these things. And that then keeps the Swedish working class from challenging the global imperialist system into which Sweden is integrated because it has the benefits. And we even see that here in the US, not that we have a welfare state anywhere near Sweden. But even a working class person in the United States can go to the supermarket and get produce that is shipped from anywhere in the world. You can go into the deodorant aisle and see 50 different options for deodorant that you want to buy for $3, right? This is like, even if it's not just about state programs, but just the economic lifestyle that we enjoy here by virtue of being in the heart of empire, even for someone who is exploited or oppressed by capitalism, is still so much greater than the working class in other countries. And so Lenin, again, identified all of this back in 1917, still holds true today. And so he identifies what he calls 5 basic features of imperialism. The concentration of production in capital that creates monopolies, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital. He gives us the term finance capital, which essentially creates a financial oligarchy. The companies become more interested in exporting capital than exporting commodities. So they're no longer just interested in selling their cloth in another country's market, but they want to go invest, they want to go buy up land and resources, they want to go establish their factories in those other countries. It's cheaper to produce there than it's produced here at home, where you have to pay your workers more, right? He also talks about the formation of essentially cartels, international monopoly capital associations that share the world among themselves. And the core of Marxism says that the state serves the interests of the capitalist class. And as a result, these capitalist powers, their governments start competing amongst themselves to divide up the territory of the world for their respective capitalist classes. So what this creates is a situation in which the world is divided into a majority of exploited and impoverished nations who are subjugated by a small minority of exploiters, of exploiter countries. These are, of course, countries like the US, Western Europe, and so on, who enrich themselves while the exploited nations struggle to develop. And it's competition between the exploiting countries that leads to what Lenin called inter-imperialist rivalry. And it was the inter-imperialist rivalry that, according to Lenin, explained the emergence of World War I, why these powers all went to war with each other. Now, it's important to remember that as prescient as it is, as many lessons as it holds for our moment today, Lenin was writing based on an analysis he made of the conditions of the global order at his moment in time. He was focused on looking at the way the world was as he could see it. And conditions have changed. So we can't just simply take Lenin's theory as gospel and apply it copy-paste to subsequent times in history, including our own. But his contributions have really formed the basis for an entire body of thought and have inspired countless generations of theorists of imperialism, both in the West, also in the Third World, over the last century, and continue to inspire and really form the basis of Marxist theories of imperialism today. So I want to just name a couple of these. I'm not going to go into too much detail about any of these particular thinkers, but just some texts are shown here on the screen. So famously, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the Ghanaian revolutionary, a Pan-Africanist theorist who was the first prime minister of Ghana after its independence. In 1965, he published a very seminal text called Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, where he was looking at the situation of former colonies after attaining independence. Even though they now have their own flag, their own government, they were still economically subservient, usually to their former colonizers. And in that, he wrote, quote, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. But in reality, its economic system and thus political policy is directed from outside," end quote. So Nkrumah's understanding of neocolonialism was built on by thinkers like Walter Rodney and others who showed how the stage for this situation had been set by centuries of colonialism. Famously, Rodney wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and that title really says it all, that colonialism underdeveloped the vast majority of the world by plundering of their wealth, keeping that these countries from being able to develop their own economies, so that even after they became independent, they really had no choice but to remain in a state of economic dependency with their former colonizers. And this idea of dependency is built on by people working in the dependency theory tradition, people like Samir Amin, Andre Gunder Frank, Giovanni Arrighi, and many others, who also worked in the schools of world systems analysis that developed concepts like unequal exchange. I'm sort of throwing these words out. I mean, we'll talk more about what some of them mean sort of throughout this course. These are all extremely rich schools of thought that have lots of debates within them and so on. So I'm not getting into all of them here, but just to say there's an entire world of Marxist and Marxian scholarship on how the global economy is structured in a way that is fundamentally tied up with imperialism, both historically and in present day. And one of those I just mentioned was world systems theory, world systems analysis. And I do want to zero in a little bit more on that, on understanding imperialism as a world system. We talked about earlier with the example of the British Empire, how this system has always been globally integrated. And so building on that understanding, thinkers like Samir Amin, Wallerstein, and others developed what's called the Core-Periphery model for understanding global orders today. Essentially, what this says is that this is a key element in world systems theory. It's a key element of dependency theory as well, which argues that the world can be divided into a few sets of countries. And the map here is just one example. There's lots of debates over, is this country in this set or in this other set? But generally speaking, the three sets are, you have the core. These are the advanced, developed capitalist countries: the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, Israel is very much part of the core. These are the countries that sit at the head of the system. They are the primary beneficiaries of global imperialism. And the people that they benefit from the exploitation of are the countries in the periphery. These are the underdeveloped countries, the most impoverished and exploited countries, the majority of the global south, Africa, Asia, Latin America, who their role in the global economy is as sources of cheap labor, cheap resources, raw materials, export commodities they export to the global north, to the core, and who essentially transfer more value and wealth to the core than they receive back in return. That is called unequal exchange. You also have, in more recent decades, the emergence of sort of middle class countries called the semi-periphery. These are sort of middle powers, countries like Brazil, India, China, Russia, Turkey are often named examples of the semi-periphery, which share elements of both. On the one hand, they benefit from the exploitation of the periphery, but they themselves also are still exploited by the core. There's a really great economist named Lenin, a Chinese economist, who has a great analysis in Monkey Review of how China is a perfect example of this, because even though China benefits from the exploitation of peripheral countries, it still transfers more wealth to the countries of the core than it receives back from them. And he really takes a very detailed analysis of Chinese trade relations and so on to make that point. So essentially, the semi-periphery, they sort of sit in the middle. They benefit in some ways, but ultimately they are still victims of the imperialist world system. They are not the primary beneficiaries. That is the core, that is the countries of the West and the global North who stand to gain most. And so this is sort of the way that I think it's useful to look at the world when we want to talk about imperialism as a global system. And with that in mind, I want to offer up a definition, a redefined understanding of imperialism that will sort of shape how we approach it for the rest of the 6 weeks of the summer school. Which is to say that as a world system, imperialism can be understood as capitalism extended on a global scale. A system that is characterized by a division of labor between nations and the exploitative transfer of wealth, value, and resources from the countries of the underdeveloped periphery to the countries of the developed capitalist core. And the way in which this system is enforced is through a variety of mechanisms, which include military intervention, which include coups and covert operations, but also include non-military things like predatory lending, economic sanctions, the hegemony of the US dollar as a currency, and many other coercive measures, as well as various forms of soft power and cultural diplomacy that we'll talk about in subsequent sessions as well. So this is a sort of reframed, redefined understanding of imperialism that I want us to work with, not just today, but for the rest of this session, that I think tries to incorporate the way that Lenin talks about imperialism, but also subsequent thinkers working in this school of thought as well. And just briefly to talk about the relationship between imperialism and global inequality, we, as I mentioned earlier, I think we all know on some level the standard of living, the degree of consumerism and consumption that we enjoy here in the global north is only possible because of the brutal exploitation of labor, land, resources in the global south. This is a concept that's often called the imperial mode of living. And this imperial mode of living, this inequality between rich and poor countries, is not only the product of centuries of colonial plunder that sort of set up from the beginning a situation where the core was already enriched at the expense of the periphery, but it also is a product of how even in the supposedly post-colonial era, the global economy continues to be structured in a way that traps the global south, that traps the periphery and semi-periphery in these vicious cycles of dependency, of underdevelopment through unequal exchange, which again is the idea that the core is getting much more out of this relationship than the periphery is. They are receiving more than they give back. And so with that in mind, I want to focus on, and I should also say here, these graphs just go to show, the one on the left is the GDP per capita from 1960 to 2017, global north and global south countries. Both of these are come from the website of Jason Hickel, who's a really brilliant economic anthropologist who's written a lot about the colonial roots of global inequality. So you see this gap widening dramatically. And this graph shows the amount in billions of dollars of wealth drained from the global south to the global north in that same time scale from 1960 to 2017. So you see, as this drain increases, the degree of inequality between the north and south also increases, which I think makes sense intuitively, but just to sort of give a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. I mean, almost $30 trillion by 2011 every year being drained from the south to the north. That is the scale of what we're talking about when we talk about unequal exchange. Now, with that in mind, I want to talk about briefly the role of the United States, where we factor into this. Because we often, I think, when I asked earlier about how people define imperialism, I was hoping someone would say American imperialism. Because I think that's usually what gets talked about in these conversations: American empire, American imperialism. Again, thinking about things like the war in Iraq, the interventions in Syria, Libya, and sanctions against countries like Cuba, right? These are not inaccurate frameworks. Certainly, the US is an imperialist power. We all know this, we're here in value of weeks. But it's important to understand concepts like American empire in terms of not looking at the US in isolation, but rather recognizing the specific and particular role that the United States occupies as the linchpin and the primary enforcer of the imperialist world system, rather than just simply looking at them as shorthand for, oh, American interventions abroad. Again, if you look at it that way, you really miss the forest for the trees. But the way that American empire works is the product of historical developments over the last 100 years. So sort of in the mid-20th century, in the aftermath of World War II, we had all of these European empires, particularly the British Empire, that had been very much devastated by the war. I mean, the war was devastating for all of Europe. And they saw the writing on the wall. There were growing anti-colonial sentiments across their colonies. They saw their imperial influence was waning on the world stage. They couldn't afford to keep up the empires that had sustained them as the head of the global system for centuries. Meanwhile, the United States is getting richer, it's rising as an economic and military power. It emerged from World War II much less devastated than, say, Britain had, right? And so rather than this sort of inter-imperialist rivalry that Lenin had identified as causing World War I, at this time, you see that sort of more chaotic state of affairs giving way to an increasingly integrated capitalist order, where the countries of the capitalist core, the United States, Britain, Germany, France, and so on, the old guard empires start to crumble, and the former colonial powers began coalescing into a new bloc, a capitalist imperialist bloc led by the US, with Western European countries sort of serving as junior partner. And they sort of justified this because they need to have a united front against the threat of Soviet communism. Of course, this would be the beginning of the Cold War. A really clear example of this is the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which we'll talk about in much more detail at the next week's session. But that really established the framework for the global economic architecture, the global financial system, which placed the US at the head with, countries like the UK, Germany, France, and so on lined up behind it as junior partners. But this is really when we start to see the US emerging as the linchpin of the imperial world system. And this new imperialist bloc wanted to cement what they call liberal international order. It's a term we hear talked about a lot, which would spread capitalist liberal democracy throughout the world. It would promote these continued exploitative relationships with the newly independent nations of the global south, or of course frame those relationships as if it's for the benefit of the global south, will help you develop and get more prosperous, even as we're continuing under neoliberal wealth. And of course, as I mentioned, to counter the influence of the Soviet and communist bloc, and particularly counter the influence of the Soviet Union in the third world. The last thing they wanted was communist movements taking power in the former colonies of Europe. This sort of liberal order reigned supreme for many decades, particularly after the 1990s, the fall of the Soviet Union, this idea of the end of history, right, and the emergence of a new unipolar order where the United States is really the undisputed hegemonic force on the world stage. That has been the order that has sort of dominated for the last few decades, but the moment we are in right now, through things like genocide in Gaza, the rise of new powers like China, we're seeing cracks beginning to emerge in that unipolar order. This will really be the focus of week 6. So there's titled The Shifting Global Order, I believe that's Sunday, July 6th. We're going to look at what is happening to the unipolar order that the US has sort of served as the hegemonic force in for the last 20, 30 years, and where do we go from here. But that's just to say that this is how we sort of should understand US imperialism and the US role in the imperialist world system. Okay, so this is, returning to the slides from before we close out, just want to talk about sort of what are the implications of understanding imperialism in this way, given everything that we talked about here today, right? So again, these are sort of misconceptions that we talked about how people often are taught to think about imperialism. And, okay, sorry. Right. Reframing imperialism in this way, I think, is important because it allows us to think about the way a state relates to the word imperialism, not being about the practices that it engages in, that the state is imperialist because it behaves in certain ways, but rather than looking at the way, the extent to which states are integrated into the imperialist world system. Is this country part of the periphery, or is it part of the core? How does that positionality shape its behavior with regards to its neighbors, with regards to other countries? And if we sort of think more carefully about that distinction between imperialism in the sense that we've defined it here, if we distinguish that from other concepts like expansionism or militarism, projecting soft power, I think that raises interesting questions about should we apply the label of imperialist to countries like China and Russia, where you often hear that word getting thrown around. You hear people say Russia is an imperialist power because of the invasion of Ukraine. China is an imperialist power because of its relationship to countries in Africa. I'm not answering that question. I think there's a debate to be had over both of those. But if we are thinking of imperialism in these terms as a global system, it's very possible that the invasion of Ukraine could be thought of as a form of, a war of conquest and territorial expansionist project, but not necessarily imperialist in the sense that Russia simply is not integrated into the world system as a part of the core. Like straightforwardly, that is not the case. So that is sort of what is at stake when we talk, like why all this matters. It really is not just a semantic distinction, but it is important to be specific about what we mean when we say the word imperialism, because if we have an imprecise definition rather, that could mean that we're not really grasping the extent and complexity of how empire functions and what the real motivations of it are. And we place focuses on the symptoms rather than on the disease itself. It also creates a false equivalency, I think, a distorted picture of a world in which any country could theoretically be classified as imperialist, regardless of what position it occupies in the global order. So a country that is in the periphery, an exploited, oppressed country that is sending massive amounts of wealth to the global north, if it goes to war with its neighbor, now it's being talked about as an imperialist country. Well, that diverts attention away from who actually is benefiting from the world system, who sits at the top, who's exerting dominance. That is exactly, I would argue, what the imperialists want. They want to muddy the waters in that way. So that is really, again, what is at stake, I think, when we talk about all of this as a world system. That is what is at stake when we talk about why it's important to reframe how we talk about empire. So I would just invite folks to reflect in light of everything we talked about, again, on this quote by Kanafani, and specifically that last line, wherever you strike imperialism, you damage it when you serve the world revolution. I think that's a really powerful sentiment to reflect on, especially given where we are located here in the Valley of the Beast, in the heart of empire. What does it mean to strike at imperialism where we are? How does that serve the revolution? I think these are questions I hope you'll take home with you today and continue to reflect on, not just today, but over the rest of this course. So to build on the foundation that we sort of established in this session, just to preview what we have coming up. So week 2, which is next week, June 8th, same time, same place, we'll focus on trade sanctions and dollar imperialism, the way that the global trade system reinforces imperialism on the world stage. After that, we'll talk about international finance, not just institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, but also Wall Street, private financial institutions. How does the global financial system and systems of debt, for example, reinforce imperialist relations? Week 4, we'll look at USAID, NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the NGO industrial complex, the role of sort of soft power in particularly projecting American empire. Week 5, we'll look at international governance, institutions like the UN, international law, and so on, how that upholds the imperialist system. And then, as I mentioned, finally, we'll conclude on July 6th by talking about shifts that are currently underway in the international order today.